We are reading Areopagitica. We were on page 211. Milton argues here that the differences between the sects mainly rise from the importance attached to things which are not fundamental to Christianity. On the other hand, things which are indifferent, which may vary from man to man, such differences are made the most of, and unnecessarily Christians split into a great number of designations, a great number of groups. Though it be not in fundamentals, and through our forwardness to suppress and our backwardness to recover any enthralled piece of truth out of the gripe of custom, we care not to keep truth separated from truth, which is the fiercest rent and disunion of all. So why Christians are divided into so many groups? Milton gives this explanation. We do not see that while we still affect by all means a rigid external formality, we may as soon fail again into a gross conforming stupidity, a stark and dead congealment of wood and hay and stubble, forced and frozen together, which is more to the sudden degenerating of a church than many subdichotomies of petty schisms. This reference to wood and hay and stubble is from St. Paul's letter to Corinthians, book 1. And here Milton says that we tend to become very formal and we formally divide things, and we are not ready to accept a new thought or new judgment. So we yield to conformity, which is a kind of stupidity. So during the Archbishop Laud's period, conformity was considered important from the point of view of Anglicans, whereas the Puritans were against conformity, and therefore they were persecuted by Laud. So Milton says that yielding to such conformist notion, we tend to divide truth into many dichotomies. So subdichotomy, this is a term taken from logic. Dividing any topic into two is dichotomy. Further division of that is subdichotomy. So this endless division and dichotomization of truth will lead to misunderstanding or misapprehension of it. Not that I can think well of every light separation, or that all in a church is to be expected gold and silver and precious stones. He says that I do not suggest that every separation is light, or that everybody can remain in the same church, or whoever remains in the church, they are all gold and silver and precious stones. This is an allusion to Matthew, Gospel of Matthew. It is not possible for man to sever the wheat from the tares, the good fish from the other fry. That must be the angel's ministry at the end of mortal things. Again, the reference to severing or separating the good corn from the tare, from the corn that has become corrupted or bad. This separation of souls, good souls or bad souls, this is not a task for human beings, but for angels after the doomsday. Therefore, Milton says that we vainly try to divide and subdivide and separate the good from the bad, which we actually do not know or which we cannot know. Yet if all cannot be of one mind, as who looks they should be? This doubtless is more wholesome, more prudent, and more Christian, that many be tolerated rather than all compelled. So, who says that all should be of one mind? So this is the logic of uniformity. On the other hand, acceptance of people of several ideologies, several thoughts, that is a kind of pluralism which Milton favors, and which of course goes against the Anglo-Catholic operation of the Puritans. So Milton says that it is much better that different opinions are allowed to express themselves. So ironically, it reminds me of what Mao Zedong said. Mao Zedong has a doctrine in his practice of communism, and he said, let 100 flowers bloom, meaning that let there be 100 opinions, let 100 flowers bloom. But in no communist regime we have seen that plurality is really allowed. On the other hand, everything is made to conform to the monolithic doctrine of one mainstream opinion. However, here also the early reformers and the Christians in Milton's time, many of them were intolerant of other opinions, and that is why there were so many schisms or sects among the Christians, among the Puritans. All compelled is not something desirable. That is, if people conform to some idea or some faith out of compulsion, that is not desirable. On the other hand, many be tolerated, that may be desirable. So, if another person or other people have different opinions than mine, then I should be ready to tolerate those opinions. What kind of differences that Milton opposes? Milton says, but those neighboring differences, or rather indifferences, are what I speak of, whether in some point of doctrine or of discipline, which though there may be many, yet need not interrupt the unity of spirit, if we could but find among us the bond of peace. The bond of peace is a phrase taken from the Ephesians. So his argument is that we unnecessarily reject opinions which are slightly different from ours, neighboring differences. That is, a difference which is not radically different, but neighboring, meaning it is almost similar to ours, maybe on some minor point of discipline or doctrine it is different. So what is discipline or doctrine? Doctrine is the theory, the theology of that particular faith, and discipline is the practice. So the Puritans, many of the practices of the Puritans were not accepted by the English Church, and many of the practices of the English Church were rejected by the Puritans. So these were, not all of them were very radical, and therefore a Christian perhaps could come closer if they had this kind of liberal and pluralistic point of view, as Milton suggests here, this Catholicism. That is actually called Catholicism, where everything is more or less accepted. That is Catholicism. But unfortunately, Roman Catholicism became just the opposite. In the meanwhile, if anyone would write and bring his helpful hand to the slow-moving reformation which we labor under, if truth had spoken to him before others, or but seemed at least to speak, who had So be Jesuited us that we should trouble that man with asking license to do so what we did. If somebody discovers the truth, when we are laboring under this slow reformation, obviously Milton is not happy with the pace of reformation, because many of the sects, many of the groups were becoming rigid, orthodox in their own belief, and therefore they refused to reform themselves further. But if somebody is able to discover the truth suddenly, if somebody comes upon the truth, then Milton uses this verb which he probably points, be Jesuited. Who has put us into such darkness or such ignorant compulsion as the Jesuits do? That is Milton's sense here. So who has be Jesuited us to ask that man who has discovered the truth for license to do so? So the point is that discovery of truth does not depend or does not wait for any license or any permission. Somebody suddenly comes upon the truth. So it is a revelation, obviously inspired by God. So this is Milton's Christian as well as Platonic belief in inspiration, belief that truth is revealed through epiphanies, through sudden illumination. And therefore nobody can tell that person to wait for the license and not consider this, that if it come to prohibiting, there is not aught more likely to be prohibited than truth itself, whose first appearance to our eyes, bleared and dimmed with prejudice and custom, is more unsightly and unplausible than many errors, even as the person is of many a great man slight and contemptible to see to. So Milton suggests that our eyes are dimmed with prejudice and custom, something against which Bacon also fought. The prejudices in the discovery of truth, in the advancement of knowledge. Prejudice is a big obstacle, and we tend to chain ourselves by customs. We do not want to accept anything new, and that is why when there is a new discovery, any new discovery is looked upon with skepticism and not easily accepted. So if somebody today discovers the truth of religion, Milton suggests, then most likely we will not be able to recognize it as truth. And therefore we will try to suppress it, we will try to ban it, we will try to prohibit it. So as I was telling you, how in this pamphlet, the argument against prohibition, against censorship, against banning becomes an argument about the problems of discovering truth, Christian truth, the truth of religion. So for Milton, obviously, any book, any printed book, any work by any author is one step forward to the discovery of the total truth. The truth of all books taken together and the truth of books that are yet to be written, all those taken together would form the absolute truth of religion and of the world. Therefore, in Milton's point of view, there is no difference between truth as scientific truth, or truth as a religious truth, or truth as a truth of literature. Milton does not look upon truth in this fashion. Throughout he speaks of truth in an abstract way. He makes truth an abstraction, as if there is one truth with T capital, which includes all other truths. So this vision is also an encyclopedic vision of the humanists. Humanists like Erasmus, Petrarch, humanists who made looked at the cycles of knowledge, who believed that the different cycles of knowledge together make one whole truth, from which the idea of the encyclopedia arose. So, paideia is a Greek word which means knowledge. Encyclopedia means cycles of knowledge. And that is why we see that the humanists did not make much difference between science and arts. So sometimes arts would be called science and sometimes science would be called arts. So it did not matter. So all this idea of a strict difference between science and art was much later developed. So the germs of that was in Francis Bacon and some other European thinkers. But the humanist vision is that all knowledge together is one knowledge, which is also the knowledge about religion. And Milton subscribed to that belief, which we find exposed in Areopagitica. Therefore, his arguments against censorship turns to be a speech not only against censorship, but a speech about the ways that truth remains hidden and that it needs to be discovered, and what are the obstacles in the process. And then he speaks of the fact that when there is an optimum possibility of truth being discovered, that happens only with God's consent or according to God's plan. And Milton obviously looked at the Reformation as God's plan, and he writes, "For when God shakes a kingdom with strong and helpful commotions to a general reforming, it is not untrue that many sectaries and false teachers are then busiest in seducing, but yet more true it is that God then raises to his own work men of rare abilities and more than common industry, not only to look back and revise what has been taught heretofore, but to gain further and go on some new enlightened steps in the discovery of truth." So you see that discovery of truth is the central thought here, and it is all propelled by God, the prime mover, who initiates this turmoil in the world of men. He raises a band of very efficient workers, but when such things happen, when there is a turmoil towards reformation, then of course there are some people who are sectaries or who make false definitions and false differences and divide the people. They are not to be supported, they are to be opposed. But nevertheless, there are others who, in an industrious fashion, who work towards the Reformation. Neither is God appointed and confined where and out of what place these his chosen shall be first are to speak. For he sees not as man sees, chooses not as man chooses, lest we should devote ourselves again to set places and assemblies and outward callings of men, planting our faith one while in the old Convocation House and another while in the chapel at Westminster, when all the faith and religion that shall be there canonized. Here Milton says that God does not work only in particular places, and so that truth is discovered only at fixed places. But we men, we tend to meet at certain particular places like the Convocation House, that is the chamber, and the chapel at Westminster. When Henry VII was reigning, convocations were held in Chapter House at Westminster. However, the Presbyterian Assembly of Divines at Westminster met in Henry VII's chapel. So whether one meets in the chapter house, in the convocation house, or in the chapel, it does not make any difference, because there is no fixed place for the discovery of truth. And men always try to discover truth and to canonize them, to make a canon, to make a list of things which are acceptable and things which are not acceptable. But if we if we read Milton's writing, then we see that Milton does not confine himself only to canonical texts, because here, when he uses the metaphor that God raises to his own work, God shakes a kingdom. When he uses this metaphor, he is alluding to a text from Haggai, one of the Jewish texts, which were neither in the Roman Catholic nor in the Protestant canon. So he is also taking material from non-canonical text. Obviously, Milton is opposed to this kind of narrow canonization. So when all the faith and religion that shall be there canonized is not sufficient without plain convincement and the charity of patient instruction to suffer the least bruise of conscience, to edify the meanest Christian who desires to walk in the Spirit and not in the letter of human trust. So whenever Christians try to settle things down, to formalize things and to make canons, somehow truth is stifled. And an ordinary Christian, Milton is talking about the meanest Christian. So the layman, the meanest Christian who does not have any power in the hierarchy of the Christian organizations, he would like to walk in the Spirit and not in the letter of human trust. So human trust, a human act of classification of truth, that cannot be trusted. But the Spirit of God, that must be felt in one's inside for the meanest Christian. This is, you can see, a very extreme Puritan point of view, or we may say a fundamental Puritan point of view, that an individual would face God, and there would be nobody in between, no priest, no bishop, no institution. I do not know whether you know that church does not actually mean an institution. Church means a collection, a collective of Christians. That is a church, not a building or an institution like collegium. Collegium does not mean, or collegium from which we have the word college, it does not mean the building, or it does not even mean the institution. Collegium or college means where all professors or all learners come together. And this term is still used by the judges. We have forgotten, or we have misused this term. Though Harry VII himself, there with all his liege tombs about him, should lend them voices from the dead to swell their number. Henry VII was buried at the Westminster Chapel. So Milton jokingly says that even if he comes alive and he tries to strengthen the voice of these people who try to institutionalize everything, he won't be able to suppress the spirit. if not for their sakes, yet for our own. Seeing no man who hath tasted learning, but will confess the many ways of profiting by those who, not contented with stale receipts, are able to manage and set forth new positions to the world. So people who have experience of learning in various ways, and they set forth new positions, that is, in the domain of truth, in the domain of knowledge, always there is a scope for some addition. And were they but as the dust and cinders of our feet, so long as in that motion they may yet serve to polish and brighten the armory of truth, even for that respect they were not utterly to be cast away. So even though these people who discover truth, they might be the meanest people, dust and cinder of our feet, yet they cannot be cast away, they cannot be neglected. So we see that Milton has a very broad attitude, very Catholic attitude towards accepting truth from whichever source it may arise. But if they be of those whom God hath fitted for the special use of these times with eminent and ample gifts, and those perhaps neither among the priests nor among the Pharisees, and we in the haste of a precipitant zeal shall make no distinction, but resolve to stop their mouths, because we fear they come with new and dangerous opinions, as we commonly forejudge them, ere we understand them. Knowledge then woe to us, while thinking thus to defend the gospel, we are found the persecutors. This is a very strong argument which should influence the members of the parliament, that whenever truth is discovered by anybody or some voice of truth is raised, since we cannot recognize it, we always try to oppose it and suppress it. And we cannot make any distinction between the eminent people with ample gifts and the priests and Pharisees. The Pharisees during the time of Christ, the Pharisees were a sect who emphasized strict obedience to the Mosaic law. So obviously they had a narrow point of view. They only wanted to stick to the law, to the letters of the law. So Milton says that we cannot distinguish between priests and Pharisees and men who have very wide, ample gifts, talents in the discovery of truth, and therefore unknowingly, without being able to judge, we suppress anybody who tries to say something new that he has discovered, and thus we end up being the persecutor while we think that we are defending the gospel. So this is an ironical situation, and the members of the parliament should take care that since they are the defenders of the gospel, they should not end up being persecutors and being the chief obstacles in the path of truth. But if neither the check that Moses gave to young Joshua, nor the countermand which our Saviour gave to young John, who was so ready to prohibit those whom he thought unlicensed, be not enough to admonish our elders how unacceptable to God their tasty mood of prohibiting is. Milton is alluding to two examples. One is that Moses told young Joshua, who was intolerant of the followers who did not side with them, with Moses. In the book of Numbers, there is this allusion. Similarly, Christ stopped John from silencing others. So these two examples from the Bible become Milton's argument against prohibition, against silencing any voice. If neither their own remembrance what evil had abounded in the church by this length of licensing, and what good they themselves had begun by transgressing it, be not enough, but that they will persuade and execute the most Dominican part of the Inquisition over us and are already with one foot in the stirrup, so active at suppressing, it would be no unequal distribution in the first place to suppress the suppressors themselves. Milton blames the Inquisition and the attempt at censorship. In that, Milton sees a Dominican influence, and these people who uphold or who promote censorship, they suppress the truth, and therefore Milton says rhetorically that it will not be wrong to suppress the suppressors. When it comes to talk about the regulation of the press, let no man think to have the honor of advising you better than yourselves have done in that order published next before this. Milton again is being very clever here. He wants to tell the members of the parliament that you do not pass this order of licensing and censorship, but he tells them in an indirect fashion, first by reminding them of a very good order that they have passed before this particular order, and that in that earlier order they enacted that nobody can use the writing of another author without his permission. So that order was very beneficial to the authors, and Milton thus kind of flatters the members of the parliament by saying this, by reminding them of this, of their good act, and then indirectly tells them not to do the bad act now, not to commit a mistake now. The earlier order that no book be printed unless the printer's and the author's name, or at least the printer's, be registered. So unregistered printing would mean piracy, and when there is piracy, the authors suffer the most because their texts are pirated and printed by others, and they do not get any benefit. Those which otherwise come forth, if they be found mischievous and libellous, the fire and the executioner will be the timeliest and the most effectual remedy that man's prevention can use. Books which are printed by piracy, if such people are caught, then they should be punished. The executioner confiscated all copies held by the printer, all the distributed copies he could find, and burned them. He also administered additional punishment that had been ordered, such as ear cropping and nose slitting. Had we lived in the 17th century England, then anyone pirating books would have to suffer, ear cutting or nose slitting, this kind of physical corporal punishment, and of course all the books would be burned. That man's prevention can use. For this authentic Spanish policy of licensing books, people have said ought will prove the most unlicensed book itself within a short while. Spanish policy. So repeatedly Milton reminds the English parliamentarians that they are here following the Spanish Catholics. They are English Protestants, but they are following the Spanish Catholics and their policy of inquisition, and was the immediate image of a Star Chamber decree to that purpose made in those very times when that Pope did the rest of those pious works, for which she is now fallen from the stars with Lucifer. Here he is alluding to the Court of Star Chamber, which was used by Charles I to deal ruthlessly with his political opponents. The Court of Star Chambers was the Court of Charles I. It was called so because on the ceiling there were stars painted on the ceiling, and Milton jokes that chamber has now fallen like the fallen angels, as the stars fell from the sky like them. So the act of prohibition, the act of licensing, is an act which a tyrant like Charles I also followed, ruthlessly opposed or punished, persecuted his opponents. Wherever you may guess what kind of state prudence, what love of the people, what care of religion or good manners there was at the contriving, although with singular hypocrisy it pretended to bind books to their good behavior. And then he says that probably behind this licensing of books there is also an attempt by a few publishers to monopolize publication. It may be doubted there was in it the fraud of some old patentees and monopolizers in the trade of bookselling, who under pretense of the poor in their company not to be defrauded, and the just retaining of each man his several copy, which God forbid should be gainsaid, brought divers glozing colours to the house, which are indeed but colours, and serving to no end except it be to exercise a superiority over their neighbours, men who do not themselves labour in an honest profession, and so on. So, some of the members of Parliament who spoke in favour of the Licensing Act, Milton says that probably they tried to deceive everybody. So glozing colours, glozing means putting some kind of a gloss to hide the ugly truth. So they wanted to be deceptive, and which were indeed but colours. These colours means rhetoric. So colours also meant rhetorical figures in a pejorative sense. That is when by using rhetoric one tried to deceive others. One tried to falsely praise something which was bad. Therefore, it had no other end except exercising superiority. So the final argument is that this order should be withdrawn. The order does the members of the Parliament having power in their hands, malignant books might be easier escaped abroad. Another end is thought was aimed at by some of them in procuring by petition this order, that having power in their hands, malignant books might be easier escaped abroad, as the event shows. But of this sophism and alliance of merchandise, I still know. So he says that maybe some people also would use this Licensing Act so that heretical books may be smuggled abroad. Milton ends his oration by appealing to the members of the Parliament to remain the true guardians of the people, and to do what they should actually do in order to protect and promote the discovery of truth by withdrawing the Licensing Act. So I have finished the text. Do you have any question? You have some question. Let me see. How did they understand which ones are the printed version and which are not? Pirated version and which are not? Yes, it was difficult. Piracy was rampant in the 16th and 17th centuries, piracy of books, and even though the Act for registration of authors and publishers was enacted, but it was not always followed, not properly followed. So we know that in Shakespeare's time there was the Book of Stationers, where every publisher registered the license, the right to publish a particular book, where the name of the author would also be written. But there was no elaborate law protecting the copyright of the authors and so on. So piracy was rampant, and how could one know whether a book is pirated? pirated books would mostly, they would not declare the name of the publisher or the place of publication. So today you see that when we do our research, we emphasize that there should be citation, and in any citation, a few facts must always be presented. That is the name of the author, the name of the publisher, or the publishing house, the place of publication, and the year of publication. So these are essential things to be revealed to ensure that a book is not pirated. Do you have any question? How does Milton argue in Areopagitica against censorship of books? Discuss his rhetorical strategy. So that is a broad question covering almost the whole treatise. How does he argue? What is his rhetorical strategy? So his difficulty with this argument is that his people belonging to his own party, to his own political and religious faith, they are in the power and they have passed this order. So Milton has to be careful that he doesn't ruffle feathers and make his own friends his enemies, and therefore he begins by flattering them, and then he gives a narrative of history, a historical narrative about the origin of censorship, and he establishes that it originated after discussing the classical period. He comes to the Middle Ages and then to the Spanish Inquisition, and establishes that it is the Spanish Inquisition that devised ways of suppressing or prohibiting books by making an index of forbidden books, and therefore to prohibit books or to exercise censorship would be towing the lines of the Roman Catholics, who were of course the die-hard enemies of the government of England at that time, and therefore Milton persuades the members of the parliament that this strategy or this policy would go against their own interest, because their own interest is to establish liberty by removing tyranny, as they have removed the monarch from political power because of his tyrannical rule, because of his oppression. Therefore, such people who have liberated the country otherwise, it will not be in their interest to pass the Censorship Act, which means that you will have to briefly follow the argument of the treatise and kind of summarize it. Milton's patriotism is evident in Areopagitica. I don't think this question will come, but in this treatise Milton has a vision about England rising as a great nation, and this vision it springs from his religious belief that the English nation are the chosen people on earth to guide others in the pursuit of true religion. So for him the true religion is the Protestant religion, and even though there were these great leaders of the Reformation all from Europe, like Luther, Calvin, Zwingli and others, but Milton makes it appear as if Wycliffe was the origin of the Reformation. Thus Milton establishes or tries to establish that the English gave leadership in the field of Reformation also, and in the matter of political, cultural, intellectual liberty, England was always ahead of other European countries, as he gives the example of Galileo being imprisoned in Italy, and how other scholars in Italy, they told Milton that he was lucky to be a citizen of England, where this kind of oppression is absent. So Milton looked upon England and his own country and his own city as the city on a hill. This trope of this biblical trope that the city on a hill, Jerusalem, that is the guiding example, and others should follow it. So so far as Milton imagines the role of the English people in the matter of the Reformation, we can see his patriotism. How is the question of Reformation allied to the issue of censorship of books in Areopagitica? So here we see that Milton uses the central trope of truth. And truth is a comprehensive abstract word which includes all partial truths, all other truths, and this truth is something which is not clear to everybody, and basically the truth of Christian religion, and this is yet to be discovered. So that is the central trope, and censorship is always an obstacle in free discovery or research, because censorship does not accept any new discovery or any new opinion, as it is mired in prejudice and custom. And therefore the two issues of the Reformation, the issue of the Reformation, which aimed at discovery of religious truth of Christianity, and the question of tolerance and freedom of expression, to the question of censorship of books, these are combined or linked together. Why does Milton argue that religious tolerance and freedom of expression are concomitant? So you can see that the argument is similar to the earlier question. Without religious tolerance means that one is not prejudiced, that one is broad-minded, one is Catholic in one's acceptance of other people's positions. Therefore, religious tolerance accentuates or helps discovery of truth. And freedom of expression, freely expressing what one discovers or what one arrives at as a new conclusion, new ideas, these become possible only when there is religious tolerance. So freedom of expression is related to tolerance. Discuss Milton's treatment of the concept of truth, that I have already discussed and commented upon. How does Milton interweave the notion of civilization to freedom of speech? Milton begins with the trope of Areopagus in Athens, the Areopagus who would judge over any debate or argument. That was the mark of civilization, because the Greeks considered themselves civilized and the Europeans imitated them. So freedom of speech was there in the Greek culture, in Greek culture and society in ancient times. And therefore, whenever freedom of speech has been carved, there is barbaric, curtailing of freedom, or there is a withdrawal from culture, a regression. This is how Milton conceptualizes or links freedom of speech to civilization. How does Milton's prose succeed being at the same time argumentative, evocative and persuasive? Which this question suggests that it should to some extent refer to Milton's use of rhetoric, his use of language, his use of examples, his use of method, and thus he makes his oration evocative, persuasive and so on. The rhetorical aspect of this oration, this treatise, is discussed in my essay, Method in Milton's Areopagitica, how the Ciceronian 5 parts of oration can be found in Areopagitica, in Milton's text. The 5 parts were proposition, narration, confirmation, refutation, digression may be there sometimes, and peroration. So basically, we can see that all these, the first is exordium or opening of the speech, exordium, then proposition, then narration, then confirmation. Confirmation includes refutation, and then in this process of confirmation there may be some digression, and finally peroration. So these can be found in Areopagitica. Okay, so we have completed the course. Do you have any other question?